It is, my name is Nick Dill. My day job is I'm the Bishop of Bermuda, but don't hold that against me. It's great to be able to welcome you all here tonight. It's so thrilling to see so many of you who come out on a windy day for this evening. Now, I don't know why you've come tonight. It may be that you've come because someone's badgered you to death and you finally agreed. And if that is you, you're so welcome and thank you. And you've made someone very happy, if nothing else, this evening. You may have come here tonight because you've got lots of questions or because you think that these Christians are absolutely nuts. And if that is the case, also, you are absolutely welcome. And I hope that you'll feel able to show us why at some point in the process. But maybe you're here for your searching, or maybe you're just here for to hear a good chat or a good talk. And there'll be wonderful opportunities later on this evening to ask those questions that you either brought with you or that have been stirred up as a result of what we'll be hearing in a few minutes' time. And the way this is going to work, just so that you know, is that Michael Ramsden, who I'll introduce in a moment, will be our speaker, and he'll speak for about, I don't know, 40 minutes or thereabouts, something like that? Yeah, something. And then after he's spoken, there'll be a little lull in the proceedings, and you can either take your ticket that you have with you and write a question that you may have, or there's some little baskets up there with other questions in. Hand them to the end. They'll be collected together, sorted into categories, and there will be an attempt to answer as many as possible. And I think the suggestion is to put, if you would like to have your question answered, to put your sort of contact details on the bottom, if you would like, so that in case it isn't answered, someone can follow up and deal with the question that you may have. There's also another way. That there will be an open mic available for people to ask questions, and more will be explained about that later on. So we'll probably alternate between having a paper question, having a question from the floor for our speaker. And it's just so thrilling to be able to welcome Michael Ramsden to Bermuda. You may not know very much about him except what you've seen in the blurb. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to say very much about him myself, because you will hear him for yourself and make your own judgment. But to say, many years ago, before I was remotely interested in being a bishop, in fact, I've never been interested in being a bishop, there was a time when I actually thought that religion was a very useful thing for people who had no brain and needed to be told what to do, or for those who were about to die. And it was with that conviction that I tried to convince others around me that that was the state of affairs. And with that, I failed my RE at school and all this kind of stuff. So I thought the whole thing was a load of baloney and rubbish and just a power trip. Anyway, needless to say, I was grateful to people like Michael Ramsden who could help me to look a little deeper than my little surface soundbite theology that I had in my own mind. And it's wonderful to be able to have someone who can answer some of our questions and raise some of the issues for us in this very complex world, where it does seem that we've got two monoliths that are sort of fighting against each other at some level. The Judeo-Christian worldview that many have grown up with, and a more secular worldview, and how they connect, and somehow why should one group have a voice louder than another, and so on and so forth. And we live in this era where there's a lot of antagonism. But we need to listen and understand, I guess, where we're coming from, and that's part of what's going on tonight. And Michael Ramsden has been around the world. He's studied in jurisprudence and done all sorts of other things, spoken at the White House. He's spoken to politicians in Europe and just about everywhere you can imagine. And so he's probably heard many of the objections and questions before. But if not, if you've got one that he's never heard, well, tonight's the night when we'll hear it. But it's wonderful to be thinking about what he's saying and then to be allowing him to address some of those things. The only thing he says you need to know about him is that he lives in Oxford, which is one of the greatest cities in the world, where I did my studies. But with a wife and 3 kids, he runs a center of the Oxford Center of Christian Apologetics, which may mean nothing to anybody, but that's what he does, apart from traveling to places like Bermuda to speak. So I am so thrilled that he's here, and I would like you to offer him a wonderful Bermuda welcome. But with the caveat that is, you know, we Bermudians are very polite and nice people, and we would never say anything nasty to each other except on the anonymous blogs that we have. But tonight's the night where you can let it out a little bit, but after he's finished speaking, if I may say. So without further ado, can we welcome Michael Ramsden to come and address us tonight? Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be able to be here with you. and especially to speak to this question that I've been asked to on, is Christianity inherently arrogant? This is a title that should make any British person feel humble that they've been asked to speak to it, although I'd like to start out by pointing out my mother is from Cyprus. I was raised most of my life in the Middle East, and so I'll be looking at this question, hopefully not with too much of that cultural lens attached. We live in a world where we have an awful lot of questions that we wrestle with and think about, but very often we don't find ourselves in a place where we have the opportunity to ask those questions, even if they're ones that mean a lot to us and they're very, very closely connected with us. And so what I'd like to try and do, if I can, is in the first 30, 40 minutes, just set out a very general, broad stall about what the Christian faith actually is and says as it relates to this whole issue of arrogance. And then throw it open to you for questions. And I'll do my very best to answer as many as I can. And as has been said, if you have a question that you would love to have answered, even if it doesn't get pulled out of a hat or you have time for the microphone, if you do put an email address or something like that, then we'll make sure someone gets back in contact with you and offers you a cup of coffee or something like that, sits down with you and talks with you about your question. So even if all you want is a free cup of coffee, that is something that you may want to bear in mind. Now, when we talk about arrogance, just generally, there are a couple of things that I probably need to deal with straight away. The first one is I want to make a slight distinction between the idea of arrogance and what a virtue that we often talk about today called tolerance. Now, tolerance has become a very, very difficult word because most of us are told we should aspire to it. But there is a problem when we talk about just tolerance generally. And let me try to illustrate it this way. Let's supposing you come and speak to me at the end and you say, Michael, have you had any Bermudian food since you've arrived? And I say, yes, as a matter of fact. Some people cooked for me fish cakes, and I had the beans with rice. Is that it? And peas and rice. Peas and rice. And you say to me, Michael, did you like it? And I say, yeah, the food was tolerable, I suppose. And let's supposing the lady who cooked it for me is standing behind me. Now, when she hears me say that, does she immediately think, gosh, next time Michael's in Bermuda, I'm definitely cooking for him again? Or let's suppose you say, well, Michael, have you met any people from here? And I say, actually, it's interesting. At lunch, most of the people I met with various different pastors of different churches here in Bermuda, who were all actually from here, and I was asking them about what it was like growing up here and so on. And you say, well, did you like them? And I say, yes, I could tolerate them. If they heard me give that answer, do you think they would be happy with my response? So here's the interesting thing. We talk a lot about tolerance today. We offer it as a virtue that everyone should aspire to, but I know very few people who actually want to be tolerated. As a matter of fact, in tolerance as we use it is a largely negative word. Tolerance in engineering is how much error you can build into a system before it collapses. In medical term, it's your ability to fight off a certain type of disease and infection. None of us are actually looking for tolerance. Actually, what most of us are looking for is respect. And respect is very different. You see, if I were to come up and say, you know what, Michael, and I were to say to myself, guys, I want to tell all of you here that I'm prepared to tolerate Nick Hill, who was just doing the introduction now. Bill. No? Dill. Dill. I'm going to blame the jet lag. You can blame it and anything on jet lag, I've noticed. But if I were to say, look, I'm prepared to tolerate Nick, what I mean by that is I think he's wrong in some kind of fundamental way. But he's either too stupid or too silly to recognize it, so there's no point talking to him. I, however, am kind, merciful, and gentle. You may refer to me as Michael the Merciful. And out of being such a wonderful person inside, I'm prepared to put up with him. You see, when I say I'm prepared to tolerate you, I'm saying something to my benefit at your expense. But if you were to say to me, Michael, what do you think of Nick? And I say, you know what, I've only known him for a short time, but I really respect him. I'm now saying something totally different. I'm now saying there's something about him that demands I treat him in a certain way. And we all want to be respected. And so as we go through this evening, we're going to now just focus on this issue of arrogance. But what we're going to be doing, partly in the first part, is just thinking about some of these definitions. Because we use these words all the time, but we very stop to actually think what they mean. Now, I'm sorry that the fact that we're going to be defining lots of language is something that I learned to do. I got taught to do it when I was doing a law degree. I got taught to do it when I used to teach in a university. And I also love reading dictionaries, which is why I like defining words. I don't know, have any of you ever tried reading a dictionary? There'll be one or two here who have. Well done. Congratulations. If you've never have done that, let me commend it to you. The plot isn't very exciting, but it does explain every word as you go through the book, which is fantastic. So let's just turn our mind for a moment to this whole question then of arrogance. Is Christianity inherently arrogant? Now, one of the reasons why we sometimes associate arrogance with something like Christianity, indeed, or almost any other belief system, is they're saying, well, yes, but they believe that they're right. They believe what they're saying is true. And therefore, that must be arrogant. So we're struggling with it, if you like, at a philosophical level. We don't like the idea that maybe if someone says something, it implies that someone else may be wrong. Which is why we often, especially when it comes to what we believe about God, we often try to come up with pictures to try to make ourselves sound less arrogant. So people may say something like this. They may say, look, Michael, everyone's on a different path. You're on a Christian path, going to the top of a mountain. And other people are on this path or that path or the Y path or the Z path. And we're all on different paths, but we're all going to the top. And so we try to talk about things in a way that we hope somehow make things sound less arrogant. But when we're claiming something to be true, it doesn't matter how you dress it up. You're always going to have the same problem. I remember speaking in London once, and after on this question about arrogance, and this guy actually stood up and he gave me that illustration. He said, Michael, if you ask me, we should think about God, we should think about all religious belief as these different paths that go to the top of a mountain. And he described, all these different paths and how they all went to the top. And when he'd finished speaking, because he looked much fitter than me, I said to him, do you climb mountains? He said, actually, I do. I said, have you ever stood at the top of a mountain? He said, I have. I said, where do you need to be standing on a mountain to see all paths from the base lead to the top? And he paused for a moment. I said, can you see where every base from the bottom leads to when you're standing on the top? He said, no, you can't. I said, where do you need to be standing to know all paths go from the bottom to the top? He said, you need to be up here. I said, that's right. I said, who has that view? And he says, well, I guess God does. I said, who are you claiming to be when you tell me you can see all paths from the bottom go to the top? And he paused. I said, look, I'm just trying to figure out which one of us thinks they're God as we talk about this subject. The picture has a sort of a humble ring about it. Does that make sense? It seems to be a way of talking about a difficult subject. But actually, the humility is false. It's not actually there. The simple truth is that when anyone claims something is true, they're going to exclude something else. If I were to stand here today and give a talk to you entitled, All Paths Lead to God, and that's what I was trying to prove to you, that every path will take you to God no matter what it is, then as I say that, I'm implying that people who believe only some paths lead to God or only one path leads to God are wrong. Now, if I were to say to you, look, only some paths lead to God, because I'm not so sure that Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, and so on had such great plans of universal salvation, and I want to say they're wrong, if I'm to say, look, only some paths will get you there, while I make that statement, I'm saying people who think all paths lead to God or only one path leads to God are wrong. No matter how you phrase any truth claim, you're going to exclude something somewhere. So the question isn't about are we claiming some kind of truth. All of us in this room to some extent are. The question is, what is the attitude that goes with it? And that leads, I guess, into the second question that we think about, especially when we come to arrogance. And it's to do with a moral question. I remember once at the end of a talk, which is structured very differently. They'd asked me to speak for 5 minutes and then do 2 hours of questions, which is an awful long time to answer people's questions. At the end of it, a lady came up and she said, I enjoyed this evening, but I was very disturbed by something. I said, what was that? She said, well, you seem to imply, or you seem to assume in some of your answers that you were thinking that the Christian faith is true and other religions may be wrong. I said, well, you would be correct in that. And she said, well, I could never agree with you. That's why I'm a Buddhist. She said, I'd never want to become an arrogant person who said other people are wrong. And she was happy to talk with me. So I said, can I ask you a few questions? And she said, of course. I said, tell me, you're a Buddhist? She said, I am. I said, are you a serious Buddhist? She said, I am. I said, didn't the Buddha say that Hindus were wrong? I said, didn't the Buddha say that the Vedas are not a divine revelation from God? And didn't he call the caste system evil? And she looked at me and she said, he did say that. I read it this morning in my devotions. I said, well, look, if you're prepared to follow the Buddha when he says other people are wrong, why don't you want to follow Jesus Christ when he says some people are wrong? She looked at me and she said, I don't like where this conversation is going. But I understand what she's saying, because what she's trying to talk about, if you like, is an attitude of the heart. Because there isn't a single person in the world that thinks that arrogance is some kind of morally beautiful attribute that we should aspire to. Which maybe brings us into this last thing, which is really to do with attitude. You see, you can claim to be truth, and you can do it in an arrogant way or a humble way. You can talk about what may be right or wrong, and you can do that in an arrogant way or a humble way. But the way we often think about it most strongly is actually to do with our attitude. And that's, I guess, what she was raising. There was an academic who lived in Oxford before I was there. I'd love to have met him, actually, called Isaiah Berlin. He was a particularly gifted writer, thinker, and wrote all kinds of books and actually a lot of short essays. If you want to read short essays to really make you think, you could do a lot worse than read some of Isaiah Berlin's work. He was very, very insightful. Now, his background, having seen the rise of Nazism and Stalinism and all of that kind of oppression in Europe and all of the terror that followed in its wake, very much informed his own thinking and writing. And when he was at Oxford, he wrote about lots of different subjects. He wrote about history, he wrote about politics, he wrote about philosophy, and so on. He was very, very gifted. And in one of his essays, he also raises this question about people who believe that they have the truth, that they know the truth, that what they think is true. And he wonders whether that's such a good idea. Maybe it's dangerous. And so he contrasted what he called monism, the belief that there's one truth, with what he talked about pluralism, maybe that there are multiple versions of truth and we need to learn to make them all work together. And because of his background, he thought about this a lot. And here's the way he, if you like, put the complaint. I think he puts it very well. He says, the enemy of pluralism is monism, the ancient belief that there is a single harmony of truths into which everything, if it is genuine, in the end must be made to fit. The consequence of this belief is that those who know command those who do not. To cause pain, to kill, to torture are in general rightly condemned. But if these things are not done for my personal benefit, but for an ism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism, fanatically held religious belief or progress, or the fulfillment of the laws of history, then they are in order. Monism, he says, is one step away from despotism. You see what he's saying? If you have someone who actually believes they have the truth, then they're just simply one step away from despotism. Now, I remember when I first read that essay, I got to the end of it, and my first thought was that Jesus Christ was described as someone who was full of truth and grace. Now, when you describe someone as being graceful, what you mean is there's a beauty to their physical movement. You may have noticed that as I walked up the stairs to this podium. When you describe someone as gracious, you are saying that there is a beauty to their inner moral movement. When Jesus Christ was described as someone full of truth and grace, there was a beauty, if you like, in their life, in his life. And Christians are called to be gracious, which is why there is a charge which is given to Christians everywhere that they should live a life which is worthy of the calling they have received. That the manner of their life and conduct should somehow be worthy of the one whom they serve and whose name they claim to be their own. And what does that really mean? Now, this is a very pressing question in many ways. A few months ago now, I was talking with, I was in a country I for what will become obvious reasons I cannot name. And while I was there, I was invited with one or two of my colleagues to meet with a man who has spent an awful lot of time in prison. He is a fanatic ideologue. His fanatic ideology is probably responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in the last few years. He has inspired some of the most violent fanatic groups in the world, many of which are operating today and right now, causing all kinds of untold misery and pain. And so I didn't actually realize who I was meeting with until he actually walked into the room. The national from the country I was in almost fell out of his chair when he saw who walked in. And he had a large smile on his face, and he's one of the most wanted people in the world right now. He's basically in arrest within this country. He can't leave this particular country. And he was very cordial and very polite, and we had an amazing time. But his opening question fascinated me. He sat down, and his opening question was this. He said, tell me, if someone believes something which is wrong, does their life have any value? Isn't that an interesting question? If someone believes something which is wrong, does their life have value? So the safest thing seemed to be to do was to ask him a question. And so I said, well, what do you think? And actually, he was very clear. He said, no. If someone believes the wrong thing, then their life has no value. And then he went on to explain that maybe that killing such people, ridding the world of them, you may actually be doing the world a favor. You could be making the world a better place by getting rid of these valueless human lives. And that explains, if you like, the kind of fanatical mayhem that he's unleashing in parts of the world right now as he inspires all kinds of terrorist organizations to put that theory into practice. So the question we're asking isn't just simply an incidental one. It's actually really very, very important. And therefore, all Christians need to have a good answer to it. And thankfully, this particular question is one that Jesus Christ actually addressed head on. Because what lies behind that question is also a question about how we understand the idea of being right, or the idea, even more importantly, of being righteous, of somehow being morally right. And it's inevitable that if someone is self-righteous, in other words, they believe that they can make themselves right, that we somehow possess a quality which allows us to look down on everyone else and pass judgment, well, that's going to lead to all forms of arrogance, and it may even lead to violence. And it is interesting, I say, that Jesus Christ actually addressed this question directly. And so it seems rather safe, since the question is Christianity inherently arrogant, to actually look at how he answered it. And so Jesus told this story. It may be familiar to you. It starts off by saying, to some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told them this parable. And then he begins to outline this parable. He says, 2 men went to the temple to pray. Now, in Arabic, in Hebrew, in any Semitic language, when you talk about going to the temple to pray, you mean one of 2 things. You either mean that you're going, if you like, almost like to an empty building. Does it make sense just to pray on your own? Or you're going to a service in which lots of people there are all together. Now, we know from the way this story is told that Jesus is talking about the second. 2 people go to a service, okay, a worship service at the temple. We know that for sure because of something he says a little bit later. We're going to come back to it in a minute. So the 2 people, they go off to a temple. And while they're there, because the word pray, if you say I'm going to the temple to pray, either means I'm going to like worship and sing, does that make sense? Like big public thing, or it means private. You have to, the context gives it the weight that you use to interpret it. Because one was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with this story. Pharisee, upright religious leader, tax collector. I'm sorry if you work for the taxation services here. You've never been particularly popular in any political economy that I'm familiar with. And, of course, the tax collectors were seen as having sold out. So the question which immediately rises is one about righteousness and self-righteousness. Who can be confident of the fact that they're leading a morally good life? And you think that the answer to the story would be, well, look, the guy who's the religious leader, he should be the morally right one. Does that make sense? He's the good guy. And the tax collector, who basically, because they were underpaid, would overcharge the taxes. And this is one of the fundamental problems of what's called systemic economic corruption within political systems. If you underpay your teachers, underpay your police force, underpay your civil service, they have to find a way within which to afford to send their kids to school and buy clothes and fooding and so on. And so they will use their profession, whatever it is, tax collection, working in the civil service, teaching, the police, to raise the money that they need in order to look after their kids, which is why public sector pay becomes actually a very important issue in making sure that any political economy is put on a stable basis. And so since the tax collector is operating this way, he's not really paid by the Romans to collect taxes, so he collects his more and he skims off the top to keep for himself. He's despised by everybody. And they both go into the same place to go and worship God. And the Pharisee, Jesus says, he stands and he basically gives a little speech. He stands by himself and prays. Now, why are they praying? Well, the answer is that every morning and every evening in the temple, there was a lamb that was sacrificed. What would happen is the priest would come and he would lead the people in a time of worship and prayer. And then the sacrifice would be made for the forgiveness of sins. A lamb would be killed so that what people had done wrong could be forgiven. And after that, the guy who was leading the service would turn around and he would walk off back through a curtain. And behind the curtain, he would burn incense and offer prayers for everyone who sat outside. And at this point, the congregation are looking at a big empty platform. So what did you do? Well, the answer is everyone stood there praying. So if any of you are familiar with the Bible and you've read Luke chapter 1, it says when it fell to Zachariah's turn to burn incense, while he went inside to burn incense, in Luke chapter 1, verse 14, it says all the people stood outside praying. So this is what you do. This is the point in the service where there's nothing going on. Okay? Does that make sense? The priest has done all the stuff he does. Here's your chance to offer up your own prayers. And so the Pharisee stands a bit by himself because he wants to be separate from the riffraff because he's a good guy. And he basically says, God, I'm doing pretty well right now. I'm tithing. I'm giving you my 10%. I'm obeying the law. I'm doing everything you want. As a matter of fact, I'm doing more than you want. You say that we should fast once a week. I'm fasting twice a week. You say I should give you 10% of my income. I'm giving you 10% even of things which don't qualify as income. And so he basically stands there and says, look how brilliant I am. And he's very confident of his own righteousness. And his prayer is incredibly arrogant. And everyone gets the benefit of hearing how wonderful he is. And after he's finished praying, Jesus says the tax collector, he stood a long way off. He's at the back of the room. He doesn't want to be near the front. He doesn't feel that good. And instead of praying looking up to heaven, which is, if you're Jewish, that's how you pray. And if you want to have fun, if you're a skeptic or an atheist or something like that, and you want to have a bit of fun, get a whole group of different, either Christians or and some Jews in the room and say, why don't we pray? They'll all do something different. Okay? The Jews will stand there and they'll look up to heaven because that's where God lives. All the Anglicans will get down on their knees and they'll look down into the ground because that's where. No, who lives down there? Wait a minute. Anyway. But anyway, they'll all do different things. But what we read is that the tax collector feels so ashamed of his life. He doesn't stand looking up to heaven. He looks down. And it says, and he beat his breast, as Jesus told the story. Now, I don't know how much news you watch, but if you watch news that comes out of the Middle Eastern area, whenever there's some kind of big shooting, bombing, killing, and they film a funeral, you'll notice something. All the men will be outside yelling and shooting guns in the air, and the women wail and they beat their chests. It's a sign of very, very deep remorse. It's a sign of being devastated. And men just don't do it. As a matter of fact, the only recorded instance we have a man beating his breast is actually recorded when one of the disciples sees Jesus dying on the cross and is so mortified by what he sees, he also beats his chest. But men just don't do it. So the fact that this tax collector is looking down as he prays, won't even look up to heaven, and beats his chest shows you how cut up inside he feels. And then he prays a very, very interesting prayer. It's written to us in Greek in the way it's recorded in Luke. He says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's how it's translated. Except the Greek word, which we have translated there into the English word mercy, is a different word. There are at least a few Anglicans in this room. We have at least one bishop here. And there may be others. And if you come from a more traditional Christian background, you may have heard of something called the Kyrie eleison. Have you ever sung that or said that? Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison? Anyone have any idea what I'm talking about at this point? Just raise up your hand. Don't be ashamed. Okay, there are 7 of you. Well, it's a Greek form of words. It basically means, Lord, have mercy, Christ, have mercy. And it's either said or sung in Greek. And that is the Greek word for mercy is eleison. And that is not the word which is used here. The word which is used here is the guy actually prays in Greek, helastatoi moi, which means, may there be a propitiation for me. Now that's how we know that these two people were at this public act of worship in the worship service at the temple. Every morning and every evening, a lamb was sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins. And after this sacrifice is made for sin to be forgiven, for wrongdoing to be forgiven, one guy stands in the temple and says, hey, look at me, God, I'm great. I'm doing everything you want and a little bit extra. And the other guy, he looks down, beats his chest, and he says, hey, may this sacrifice, may it be for me. May this provision for forgiveness, may it be for me. may what has been offered up here that makes it possible for wrongdoing to be taken out of my life, may that be for me. And Jesus then says something really incredible. He says, I tell you that that man, the tax collector, went home having been justified before God, not the other. In other words, Jesus says, the guy who left that place in a right place with God, a good place with God, wasn't the one who stood there boasting about how morally superior he was to everybody else. It was the one who stood there and realized that they needed forgiveness. Now, what Jesus is talking about here in this parable is like a little illustration of what's called the gospel. The Christian faith is inherently humbling. The Christian faith should be inherently humbling. There is no room for any arrogance or boasting or anything else. It basically is saying that we need forgiveness for stuff we've done wrong. All of us. We've all done stuff wrong. We're all sinners. Look, if you're sat here today and you believe that you're a good person, that you don't do anything wrong, there's only one way out of that state of self-deception. You must get married. Now, we have all done stuff wrong. And going to the temple isn't a chance to show off before God about how morally compliant we are before him. It's coming before him to say, hey, all the areas where I failed in my life, I need that forgiveness too. Now, this is often now where Christianity is seen as being very arrogant. Because if a Christian is asked, hey, how sure are you that you're going to go to heaven when you die? Christians who know this forgiveness will say, I'm 100% sure. And the question is, surely that is very arrogant. How can someone be so self-assured, so arrogant, to assume and to think that as soon as they die, everything's so perfect, they're going to go straight to heaven? And it's a misunderstanding. It's quite a chronic misunderstanding. If Christians who felt they had assurance of heaven were like the Pharisee, the religious person, hey, I'm morally perfect, God, I'm so good, even you can't wait for me to get there. Well, that is arrogant. But that is not the Christian basis of assurance. I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience where you've accidentally insulted a friend. Has that ever happened? You were speaking to them and you said something, and as soon as you said it, you wish you could take the words back? Yeah, I see a few of you who've identified with that. Maybe we should offer prayer for healing at the end of this. Anyway. It's a terrible experience, isn't it? You say something, and you would give almost anything just to get 5 seconds back. In a sense, as soon as the words left your lips, you'll do anything to give it back. So as soon as you said the thing that you wish you'd never said, what's the first thing you do? Well, you apologize. I am so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I never should have said that. Please forgive me. Now, it's interesting what happens next. If the person you're talking to says, oh, forget about it. Don't worry. It's nothing. The very next day, when you see them, you could be here, and they could be at the other side of this room. You could look at them, and in 1 nanosecond, you can look in their eyes and know if they've forgiven you. Have you ever noticed that? It's incredible, isn't it? And if they haven't forgiven you, you go up a second time, and you say, look, I'm just so sorry. Please forgive me. And they go, oh, it's nothing. And now it's hard, isn't it? You're trying to admit, I was wrong. But they're not even allowing you to admit that you were wrong. Does that make sense? There's no reconciliation which is possible. Reconciliation occurs when the person who's done something wrong is willing to admit it, and the person who's been wronged is willing to forgive. If both of those happen, now real reconciliation is possible. So let's supposing while I was speaking here at this point, I decided to launch again into a long moral attack on Bishop Nick again. I'm sorry, the person who introduces me always gets picked up on. That's why so few people are willing to do it. And let's supposing I were to attack him, his family, his background, his record. I was to question his integrity. I was to hurl all kinds of slanderous insults against him. And let's supposing that tomorrow morning I'm speaking somewhere at lunchtime tomorrow. I can't even remember where it is, but is it by a harbor somewhere? Okay, so you see me sitting by a harbor, and I'm getting ready to speak at this lunchtime meeting, and I'm having a cup of strong coffee, and you come up and you sit next to me and say, Michael, I was at that meeting last night. Really interesting how you, those things you said about Nick. How is the relationship between you and the Bishop of Bermuda? And I say, you know what? He's my closest friend. He's the closest person, he's the best friend I have on the planet right now. Now, I would have to have the emotional intelligence of a carrot, okay, for that to be true, right? But let's supposing after I insulted him from this platform, after everybody left, he came and he put his arm around me and he said, Michael, why don't we go and talk? And he took me down to the harbor and we actually stayed up all night talking, through the morning. And as he talks to me, he makes it clear that he bears no ill will to me whatsoever. And he's willing to forgive me. And then later in that morning, I just break down into tears and I say, Nick, I'm just so sorry. I have no idea why I said what I said. It was completely out of line. I made things up about you. I can't believe what I said. I'm in a difficult place in my life right now. Here's what's going on. And he just sits with me the whole time. And he prays with me. And now when you come to me, he's just left with me with a cup of coffee. He just walked out 2 minutes ago. And now you sit next to me and you say to me, Michael, how's your relationship? And I say, he's the best friend I have in the world right now. Well, now all of a sudden I'm speaking the complete truth and there's not an ounce of exaggeration in it, is there? You see, it's amazing about how forgiveness works. If the person you have offended is willing to forgive and you're willing to say, I'm sorry, you can get peace like that. I'm not talking about saying, I'm sorry if I hurt you. That's how husbands apologize to their wives. That's not an apology at all. That's a simple statement of emotional regret. It means life was pretty good right now, and then I said something stupid, and I can see you're upset, and now I'm feeling sorry that you feel so upset because my life got a whole bit harder than it was a few minutes ago. That's not an apology. An apology is, I was wrong, and I'm sorry, I was wrong. And when you say that word, I'm sorry, you receive the forgiveness that's been offered to you by the other person. Repentance, saying I'm sorry, is how you receive someone else's forgiveness. And if you receive the forgiveness which has been offered, there's complete peace between you and that other person. It's the most incredible, if you've ever experienced this in any form of human restoration of relationship, it's one of the most incredible experiences you can have. Because there's a closeness that follows in its wake, which is unbelievable. And Jesus is saying, hey, if you want to be right with God, if you want to be justified with him, this is exactly what it looks like. Jesus is saying, look, I have come into this world as the Lamb of God, and I will take away all the wrongdoing. I'm going to pay the price for what you guys have messed up with. And I'm offering myself up for what you guys have done wrong. And if you're willing just to come into my presence and say, I'm sorry, well, I'm offering you this forgiveness as a free gift. And when you say those words, you receive it. And it's one of the most humbling things in the world that can happen to you. Because you have to admit that you're wrong. You have to confess the reality of it. And you're recognizing there's nothing you can do to make the situation better apart from receive the forgiveness which now God himself is offering you. It should manifest itself in the most inherently humbling way you can possibly imagine. So there is absolutely no room for arrogance in the Christian faith. That's why one of the early Christians, a guy by the name of Paul, said, where is my boasting? Well, it's precluded. I can't boast in anything apart from Jesus Christ and in the cross of Jesus Christ. Because he is the one who came to forgive me, to rescue me, to save me. He's the one who paid the price for me. I didn't deserve it, but he did it for me. And now I know this forgiveness. It should be inherently humbling. So look, if you've met a lot of Christians and your assessment of them is they're just simply a bunch of hypocrites, well, we have good news for you. This is a small island. If you give us a list of names and addresses, the bishop and various other pastors who are here in the room today, we'll go visit them on your behalf, and okay, we'll sort that out. But I would want to encourage anyone in this room who's been put off what the genuine Christian faith looks like because of an arrogance that they've encountered in someone else's life, especially if it was a self-righteous, self-assured one, not to turn your back on the reality, on the genuine thing that's been offered, because you may have encountered something counterfeit. There is something which is genuinely humbling when you come into his presence and find this kind of peace. And it's also something that brings great joy. Well, that's basically everything I was planning to say for this evening. So you've done very well. Most of you are awake, which is a first for me. I'm very happy about that. So here's what's going to happen now. There's going to be a short break because some of you will need to run to the restroom. Others of you will need a stiff drink. And then there'll be a time for Q&A. And as we said, you'll be able to ask your questions in person if you want to. Otherwise, you may want to write your question down. Now, as we said, if you want to write your question down, so you can either read it at the microphone, that keeps it concise, then do that. But if you are going to write your question down, and people will come up and down and collect the questions, and then they'll be like grouped into groups, does that make sense? And then we'll like try to do questions in groups, so all the questions around the same subject. We'll try to, maybe read out 2 or 3 and answer it generally like that. If you have a question that's really pressing to you, if you do put down either a phone number or email ID or something like that, then our promise to you is that someone will get back in contact with you, take you out for a cup of coffee, and then try and answer that question as best as they can. So if you don't want your question to be missed, because we're not going to be able to stay here till midnight answering questions, it means that your question will get answered in the next couple of days. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to speak to you and for putting up with me. It's wonderful to come and visit here. This is my first visit to Bermuda. I've already fallen in love with the food. That means I'll be back. That's the bad news. But the good news is now comes the break. And you've been a very, very gracious audience in listening to what I've had to say on this subject matter, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you very, very much for having me. I can remember speaking at a set of university meetings several years ago now, and this a lady came to every meeting. There were 5 evenings in a row, and every evening she came to the meeting, and every evening she sat in the same seat on the front row. And so after a while, I began to recognize her. And I can remember thinking, if she comes on the last night, I'm going to come and just sit down next to her and just ask her what's been going on. Because at the end of every talk, there was the opportunity for anyone who wanted it to pray and to become a Christian. And every evening, it looked like she was about to stand up, and then she would sort of sit back down again. So on the last evening, sure enough, there she was, same seat, front row. And I went down and sat next to her. And I said, I hope you don't mind. I said, I have noticed you've been coming every night. I said, every night. I said, I may have been misreading it. It looked like there was an expression on your face every time I ended the talk, and I thought that maybe you were going to respond in some way, and then it looked like you changed your mind and sat down. And she said, yeah, that's correct. She said, I've been trying to respond to what you've been saying by standing up on the inside. So I said, well, do you mind if I ask you what's been going on? And she said, well, I was sexually abused by my grandfather for many, many years, from the age of 12 onwards. And she said, if I become a Christian, I'm worried I'll have to forgive him. So I said, well, are you seeing a therapist right now? And she said, I am. I said, well, what's your therapist advising? And she said, well, my therapist is telling me I need to hold on to my anger and just direct it against him. So I said, well, is that helping you? And she said, no. She says, I feel like I'm being destroyed on the inside. I said to her, it sounds to me like you're paying twice for what happened to you. Once, whenever he did this terrible thing to you, and secondly, every single time you remember it. And she said, that's right. I said, now look, when you forgive someone on the inside, that's not saying you're releasing them from any legal consequence that should flow from their action. There's legal consequence that should flow from his action. But when you release it from the inside, I said, the Bible speaks very powerfully about not letting a root of bitterness come and spring up in your heart. Because when that bitterness takes control of your heart, it poisons everything else. I said, and when you hold on to that bitterness, they don't suffer, you suffer. And she said, that's correct. I said, that's exactly how I feel. I said, all I can say is, yes, if you've received this forgiveness from God through Christ, God tells us to forgive others as we have been forgiven. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't suffer legally for what's happened. You release him on the inside so it doesn't eat your own heart. He has to face up with the legal consequences of what he's done. Now, there may be some extreme consequences where getting real relationship back, even after forgiveness, simply isn't possible, because it may not be safe, and this is a good example of that. But we're now talking about quite extreme examples. If the question that has been raised here is just simply this, I've been hurt many, many, many times, over and over and over again, my encouragement to you would be, you need to find a way to let go, does that make sense, on the inside, to forgive from within. Now, Here's the interesting thing about forgiveness. Forgiveness cannot be received by the other person unless they're willing to admit they've done something wrong. Make sense? The way you receive forgiveness is by saying, I am wrong, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And if that repentance is insincere or isn't meant, they can never truly receive it from you, and that peace will never come. I said, so even if at some point there's some kind of relational peace, it will only be because of this complete, unambiguous confession, admission. That make sense? I was wrong. So look, I really hope that helps. Depending on who asked this question and depending what lies behind it, I would encourage you, if you haven't talked about it with anyone before in any kind of depth, then if you're willing to make yourself known towards the end of this, we would love to put you in contact with someone here in Bermuda who you may be able to talk to more, just to process that through. But it's a great question to start with. These things are always harder in practice than they are just simply to talk about. But there's also a huge path to freedom that can come through if we're able to get there. So thank you very much for that question.
Great. Are there any questions from the floor yet? There is right here in the back. All right, while we're getting that set up, let's just go to another question, Michael. We have one entitled, with a little title here, Hate and Arrogance. What would you say to the Christian who has so much hate and discrimination toward people who are gay, and he used the Bible to support such prejudice?
Okay. And is there another question there with it too? I see another one behind it, yeah. Oh, no, that's different.
Different, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So, wow. Well, first of all, let me start off by saying that anyone who has experienced hate from a Christian in this kind of way, then I am very sorry. That is something which, as Christians, we're told that we should not do. There's a famous verse in the Bible that talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Now, there are some good Christians here, and you should all know Galatians 5:18 off by heart. Some of you can even sing it to me. Okay? The fruit of the Spirit, it's singular. Now, let me just set it up in context, just to try to give it a bit of context. The book of Galatians is one of the first books written in the New Testament. We're not sure if it's the first, but it's one of the first parts of what we call the New Testament. It's written by a believer called Paul to a church in Galatians, and Paul has at least two concerns in that book. He has more, but he has at least two. Number one, he wants people to know what the true gospel of Jesus Christ is, rather than the false gospel. So he starts off by talking about a true gospel and a false gospel. And he basically says, hey, the false gospel brings a curse. Okay, cursed is the person who speaks it, and cursed is the person who lives it. The false gospel is a gospel that basically says, if you try hard enough, God will forgive you. He says that gospel is a curse. If that's how you think God relates to you, your life is going to be a mess. He says the true gospel is about grace. Okay? God wants to forgive you even though you have done wrong, and he's paid the price for you to be forgiven. Then he turns his attention to the true Christian. What is a true Christian versus someone who isn't a Christian? Yeah, in other words, just because someone goes around saying, hey, I'm a Christian, doesn't make them a Christian. He says you need to look beyond that. He says, and then he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. He's saying you can taste it. If you find a Christian, you should be able to taste the fruit of their life. Does that make sense? So what the Apostle Paul is basically saying to everyone is, bite me. But he's saying it in a really nice way. Okay? He's very, very friendly. He's saying, look, you should taste my life. Okay? Taste the life of the Christian. The life of the Christian should taste of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on. That's what it should taste like. The words hate, arrogance, and so on, they don't appear in that list. As a matter of fact, he says, if what you taste is anger, hatred, lust, malice, envy, then they may be claiming to be a Christian, but they're not. Does that make sense? In other words, the Apostle Paul is inviting people to critically look at everyone who says, I'm a Christian, and say, look, don't just accept it because they say it. Taste it. Now, let me also be perfectly upfront here. We're not claiming to be perfect. Okay, so I make plenty of mistakes. I have to apologize a lot. Okay, if my wife were here, she would be able to provide you with a very long list of things that I'm currently in the process of apologizing for. So it's not claiming perfection. It's saying, but the direction The direction, overall direction we're heading in should be like that. So there is no room for that kind of hatred or whatever. That's just simply not an attitude which is made available to us and that we should draw on. We are called to reach out with love and with kindness to everybody, even people we may regard as enemies. The guy I was telling you about earlier, at one point I was there with my colleague and boss, Ravi Zacharias, and Ravi gave an answer to this guy, and the guy didn't like it, and he said, "This makes me want to reach for my gun." And everyone in the room went very quiet at that point. I remember thinking, anyway, I won't tell you what I thought, but the words, "I'm not paid enough to do this," did occur to me at one point. But what Ravi said was very gentle to him. Does that make sense? He wasn't cutting across him at all. But that was his response. We're told that if people respond with anger, it shouldn't be because they have any good grounds against us. So that means we have to be very careful how we act, very careful how we speak, very careful how we treat people. To treat someone with respect, you see, this is what is now really important, and here's something I think that we forget. There is a problem when tolerance becomes a virtue as defined by modern language today. Tolerance as defined in modern language today becomes the enemy of freedom. What do I mean by that? The way we define tolerance today means that you cannot tolerate someone and disagree with them. That makes sense? As soon as you disagree, you cease to be tolerant. But you can respect someone and disagree with them. Do you see the difference? And we have forgotten in our civilized societies how to disagree well with each other anymore. You can love someone and disagree with them. Very often we think love and affirmation go together, but actually they don't. As a matter of fact, sometimes the reason we may disagree with someone or even tell a child no isn't because we hate them, it's because we love them. So love and affirmation aren't even the same thing. As a matter of fact, the best friends we have are the people who respect us, love us, and are the ones who can say no to us or tell us when we're wrong. Does that make sense? Those are the closest friends we have. So regardless of whatever you think about whatever is right and wrong, first of all, there's an attitude that we are commanded, that Christians are commanded to embrace. Okay? It doesn't mean that, therefore, that everyone's going to believe the same thing. That's not the case at all. It means that we have to learn how we treat other people as human beings. And we have to start there. Now, I happen to have working with us two, as a matter of fact, when Ed Shaw comes here, is he doing any public meeting or is he just coming to speak to? There are two people who work on my team who speak about this issue very publicly, both of whom, one is a guy called David Bennett. He's Greek. Now I know what you're thinking, if any of you know about names. Bennett is not a Greek name. When he arrived in Australia as a refugee from Greece, and the immigration official, obviously white Australian, said to him, "What is your surname?" And he said it was something like Haji Papadopoulos. They said, "That won't do. Okay, give me another name." And his mother was a big fan of Pride and Prejudice, and the family was called Bennett, so they became the Bennetts. David Bennett grew up most of his life in Australia. He was a gay rights activist. He was the guy with the megaphone standing outside the church yelling at them, "You're all a bunch of bigots and I hate you." And if you get online and Google him, you'll be able to hear about how he became a Christian and what God has done in his life since then. There's another guy who works on staff with us called Sam Albury. He's written a very little book I'd recommend called Is God Anti-Gay? Sam Albury, at the age of about 17, 18, realized he didn't just have feelings with his friends, he started having feelings for his friends and began to realize that his sexual orientation was different. And that realization came to him at the same time while he got interested in what it meant to be a Christian. And so that book then also describes what happened there. It's not a very big book, it's probably only 70 pages long, very, very easy to read. So if either of those would be of use to you, here's what I'll do. You can order any of Sam's books online very easily through Amazon. You can get David Bennett free. If you're sat here today and you're not a Christian, but you would like either to get one of these books or a resource from us completely free of charge, if you go and speak to Jim Wigglesworth, who's standing just there, looking very dapper with the little thing in his pocket. If you go to Jim and tell him, look, Jim, I'm not a Christian, but I'm really interested in getting a book either on this or something else, okay, we will send you a free book. It's our gift to you. You can have it. If it's on this subject, you can have it on this one. Any other book I mentioned, you want it, we'll send it to you for free. Now, there may be a few Christians here, and you're thinking, I'd like one of those free books. And you're thinking to yourself right now that you're going to have a little crisis of confidence in your faith in order to claim a free book. And to all of you, I'd like to say, there will be a day of judgment. And you will be held to account for what you did tonight. But for everyone else, there's Jim. Go and speak to Jim, and we'll send that to you.
This next question has to do with racism, black and white, and nationalism. Locals, Bermudians, and expats are very divisive topics in Bermuda. How should Christians in Bermuda address these topics humbly? What does the Bible say about these topics? Go.
I love the question. First of all, let me start off by saying I'm not running for political office, right? So, okay, let me, now to speak specifically about the context here in Bermuda, this being my very first visit, so let me just try and talk more generally. With issues to do with racism, historical wrongs, and so on, we have at least one major problem, and we've already hinted at it. So let me just say a little bit about what it means to act in love. And again, if you want a free link to this talk, then speak to Jim, or where's Todd? Who's been driving me around? Is he here, or is he now hiding outside in the car? Anyway, he was telling me he had a link to this laptop, a link to this talk on his laptop, so you can have it. But real love doesn't simply mean saying yes to everybody around you. Sometimes you're going to have to say no. And we have to understand what that looks like, because we're living in a world that's increasingly deprived of love and compassion. Now, the reason why we think love always means saying yes to people is we think the issues of love and judgment are in opposition to each other. Does that make sense? So it's another one of the questions I often get asked. If God is so loving, why does he judge people? You know, if God is love, he shouldn't judge. If God judges, then he isn't loving. So people feel there's somehow this tension, but we fundamentally misunderstand something here. I don't know if any of you have either read Pride and Prejudice or seen the BBC adaptation. Any of you seen the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice? Just put up your hand if you have. Wow, that's quite a few of you. If you haven't seen it, you're probably both male and single. The book, Pride and Prejudice, the BBC adaptation in particular, which is a very faithful adaptation of that book. And if you haven't seen it, it is worthwhile watching. If you have seen it, you may notice how much I look like a guy called Mr. Darcy. If you're not familiar with the story, it tells a love story between a guy called Elizabeth and a guy called Mr. Darcy. And Darcy falls in love with Elizabeth, but he doesn't realize it. And what happens is Mr. Darcy comes to call on Elizabeth, but she's all alone. She's not accompanied. So when he's shown into the room where she's standing by herself, he immediately apologizes. Because as a gentleman, he cannot be alone in a room with a woman to whom he's not betrothed. And I'd like to say, as the father of 2 daughters, I believe this is the only acceptable pattern of behavior that there is. So he immediately apologizes, and he says, I had no idea you were unaccompanied, otherwise I would not have called. And then he starts to walk out the door. And he's literally halfway out the door when he stops, he turns around, he re-enters the room, he looks at her, and he says, it will not do. My feelings cannot be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how much I ardently admire and love you. Now, gentlemen, listen carefully. That line is a winner. Now, sadly at this point, he keeps talking. He goes on to say that he loves her even though it goes against his will, his reason, and his own better judgment. And she rejects this declaration of love, and being a man, he can't understand why. So he says, I may inquire how you so easily reject me. And she says, you told me you loved me even though it went against your will, your reason, and your judgment. In other words, you told me you loved me, she said, even though it went against your will, your reason, and your own better character. In other words, she's saying, you told me even though it went against all better judgment. So here's the key thing. True love doesn't exist in the absence of judgment. True love exists in the presence of it. True love exists when you're in the presence of someone who knows you. Does that make sense? The real you. Your weaknesses, your failures, your shortcomings, and they love you. That makes love meaningful. Love and judgment are not two opposing categories. They are in the same category. The closest friends you have are people who've made a true judgment as to your character, and yet they love you. Those are the most meaningful things they have. In the sense that that's what makes love meaningful. Now, why do I give that preamble to a question about this? Well, to truly exercise love and compassion in this world, we also need to exercise forms of moral judgment. You have love and compassion in the face of racism when you make a moral judgment. That is wrong. And you're moved in your being to do something about it. Does that make sense? That manifests itself in terms of love and compassion. You do something about it. If you don't do anything about it, you don't have any form of compassion. You just have moral theory. You have compassion in the face and love. You have love and compassion in the face of poverty when you make a moral judgment about it. That is wrong. And then you're moved in your being to do something about it. If you're not moved in your being to do something about it, you don't have any form of love and compassion. You just have moralizing again. Now, one of the reasons why I think we live in an increasingly compassionless society is we're scared of making any form of moral judgment anymore. So all we have is our feelings. Well, I feel bad about this. And then the feeling goes away. Or you see so much poverty on TV, you just get what's called compassion fatigue. You just feel tired. Oh, okay, more poor people. Yeah. Okay, well, I've got problems at home. That's not the basis for a Christian understanding about how we deal with racism, poverty, and so on. It's not about just simply having a feeling inside. It's first and foremost about making a proper moral judgment. That is wrong. And then knowing that we're called to do something about it, to respond. So what do we do with racism, discrimination, inaction in face of poverty or whatever? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out, is this actually right or wrong? And when we've answered that question, then the next thing is, well, what does that then demand of me? We very often talk about justice in this world, and what we mean by justice is, hey, you need to do something to put it right. When the Bible talks about justice, the first question is, what are you doing to put it right? So the question then comes down to us. What is my role in this to try to make this different, to make this better? So this is why most of the historical human rights agencies in the world that you're familiar with in the West, regardless of what they are, whether it's something like the Red Cross or whether it's any of the classical human rights movements, were all founded by Christians. Which is understanding that this is wrong, we have to do something about it, okay? And this is what we're going to do. So if this makes you feel uncomfortable as a Christian, it probably should do. Martin Luther King wrote a very famous letter called A Letter from the Birmingham Jail. If you've never read anything by Martin Luther King, just read that letter. Go and Google it, Letter from a Birmingham Prison. It'll take you 10 minutes to read it. In that letter, what you have to remember if you read this letter is that Martin Luther King wrote that letter in prison. He was in prison in Alabama, and his lawyer visited him. Martin Luther King wrote the letter to the church, to a group of clergymen who were criticizing his behavior, and smuggled it out of the prison. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is you'll realize how brilliant a man he was. Because he wrote this letter with he had no reference volumes, he had no books, he had no Google, nothing to look up. Everything he wrote in that letter was from memory, from his heart. And if you read that letter, you'll see how brilliant a mind he had. And what he basically says is, look, I am here doing what I'm doing because injustice is here. He says, so I have to be here. And then he then talks about how God has, throughout history, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, compelled people to go and take a call of gospel to bring freedom and also to respond to what he calls the Macedonian call for aid. And if any of you are Christians here, you should recognize what that phrase means. He says, I have to go. And then he says something very interesting. He says, I'm a pastor, my father is a pastor, and my grandfather is a pastor. He says, I love the church, and I'm weeping over it right now. He says, where is the voice in the church that's speaking with a clear, clarion voice into all of these issues? Where is she? Where are the people who are standing up? He says, as I walk around the south, he says, I see all these beautiful white pointed spires pointing towards heaven and pointing people towards Christ. He says, but where's the voice? Where's it gone? And he ends his letter by saying, God's judgment is on the church as never before. If she rises to meet this hour, she may well recover some of her splendor and be seen once again as a force which is able to change the mores of society. But if she remains silent, and then he starts to paint a very bleak picture after that. It's a very beautifully written letter. If you haven't read it, I would urge you to read it. And in many ways, it sums up so much, I think, of what the church should think and believe about racism. Now, you also asked a question about expatriates, which I'm not going to answer because I've only been here for 2 days, but it's already looking good. And so I may have a vested interest in wanting to come back, for a longer period of time. So I'll skip over that part of the question and we'll take another one.
Good evening. Just a little follow-up to that.
Yeah.
If you are a parishioner in churches nowadays where you talk about, the churches need to rise, what happens if you're in a church who is not necessarily rising to the challenge of today's society or is rising and saying opposite of what you have been taught all your life, biblically, as what is truth and what is not truth?
Yeah.
What do you as a parishioner, where does that put you? And how do you kind of deal with that conflict? Do you just stay silent within that church? Do you get up and walk out? Do you say something? How do you deal with those challenges in today's society?
You know what, that's a great question. And we can almost begin to wrap this up here, because I know some of you will need to leave, and it's coming up for 9. And by the way, I'm happy to stay down here at the front for as long as any of you would like to come and talk to me. I'll happily stay down here and answer any questions. If you want to just find out questions about our organization, what we do, resources that we could help you with, and so on, if you go speak with Jim, then Jim will do that. But here's what I would say. I think it's always important, if you're just a part of a church, to think, you know what, there are times when I need to bring something to the attention of the leadership which are here, to see how they respond to it. We need to do it with loving kindness and gentleness, but we also need to be able to speak it. And then the next 2 questions are, do I feel I'm called to be in this place to help effect a change and bring it on? Does that make sense? Or do I actually think that I would be better placed somewhere else, where this is an active part of whatever I feel called to be part of? Either way, I would say, do it well and do it with a lot of grace, because all kinds of people are blind to all kinds of things. So when we see other people's blind spots, it's very easy to point them out, and we love doing it. The problem is when people like to point out our blind spots. So the best advice I'd give you is share this with someone in the same way you would like someone to share it with you if they were pointing out one of the blind spots in your life. And sometimes actually modeling what you're talking about is the most effective way of bringing about change. Does that make sense? In other words, just getting on and doing it in a beautiful way, and it inspires so many other people. As a matter of fact, we're sadly lacking in a lot of these motivational role models in a positive way right now. There are all kinds of role models out there in the world right now modeling themselves on violent patterns of behavior, and that brings all kinds of, by definition, bloodshed in its wake. We actually need people who are willing to lead the charge on various issues while in the process of laying down their lives serving other people. So the Christian view of martyrdom is very different to the non-Christian view of martyrdom. The non-Christian view of martyrdom largely consists of dying while killing other people. The Christian view of martyrdom, the Christian calling of martyrdom, is actually to lay down your life in service of other people. And that's a whole other different type of calling. Does that make sense? That's very good. Did you want to raise one last question? Or?
I do. I have one, and I think it would help to wrap up things as well. Coming from your invitation to invite people, if they want to stay afterwards, to come up to you. So this is a good question to end with. Please explain, what is an apologist? Thank you.
Okay. So you may have seen I'm a Christian apologist. Let me explain what that isn't. That doesn't mean I tell people who Jesus is and then say, I'm really sorry I had to do that, but I have to because of what I believe. Okay? That's not it. The word apologist comes again from a Greek word we find in the Bible, apologia. It refers actually to what a defense lawyer would do on behalf of his client. If someone came and raised up issues accusing you of someone, you needed a defense lawyer. And what the Bible basically says is that you need to be ready to bring a defense when people bring those kinds of questions to God or to what it means to be a Christian. If you were to think about it, the most deeply seated questions that probably exist in this room right now, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, are moral complaints about God's character. Why does a God of love allow suffering? How do I understand the process of judgment? If God wants us to believe in him, why doesn't he make us more obvious? Why doesn't he make himself more obvious? And so on. Does that make sense? We raise, whether we're believers or non-believers, significant questions about God's moral character. God, who are you? What kind of God are you? Because you can't trust someone unless you believe they're morally trustworthy. The next biggest group of questions that probably exist in this room are actually moral questions about the church. Aren't you all a bunch of hypocrites? Okay? Why does this make a bigger difference in your life? And so on. Now, the third group of questions we have are questions actually which are more about, well, how do I know this is true? And how do I understand how science may connect with this? Or whatever. Does that make sense? They're questions which don't necessarily have a moral component, but they're very important. What I would like to say, therefore, is if you are here and you're interested in those kinds of questions, I know that, and I think there were some flyers being handed out, there is something being put on by some of the churches here called the Alpha Course. And the Alpha Course is actually a way to come and find out about what the Christian faith is. It involves a short talk. Does it involve food? It involves a free meal. And then the opportunity to ask questions in a small group. Okay? There aren't professional question answerers in those groups. Those groups are with other atheists, agnostics, people who aren't sure what they believe, Christians, where you can raise the question, does that make sense, in a meaningful way, and talk about it as a group to try and figure out, well, what do I believe, and how do I understand these questions? So if you've never done one, I would encourage you to come do one. You may really enjoy it. Now, you may be sitting here and you describe yourself as a hardened atheist. You were one of the people who was dragged here against your will, and you're thinking, well, there's no way I'm going to go to a Christian Alpha Course. But if you're a hardened atheist, I mean like a really convinced one, you're morally obliged to do the Alpha Course. Now, let me explain that to you. If you're a morally hardened atheist, you think that what Christians do by going telling other people about Jesus is wrong. They shouldn't be going around converting people. And the churches that put on this Alpha Course, they're sending people all over the world to go and tell people about Jesus, but you believe that's wrong. But because Alpha involves time, salaried people, and food, if you go to the Alpha Course, you'll be consuming resources that would otherwise be used to convert someone else. So it's time to take a hit for the team, okay? And stop that bad stuff going farther afield. Yeah, you stop it right here. You go along to the course, and you just absorb all of that resource into you. Is that okay? All right, you guys, I've absolutely loved being here. I only got in last night. I had the privilege of spending some time with 20, 30 pastors or so from all kinds of different churches at lunchtime. That was an education in and of itself. It's been wonderful to be here tonight and just see so many people from, I don't know, I guess every walk of life. I'm not sure what every sector of this society you'll represent in terms of its economics or politics, but it's a privilege for me to be here. I'm looking forward to the next few days, but I want to thank you also for at least giving the time to consider these questions. I really hope it's been useful. As I say, I'll be down here at the front, and just thank you so much for allowing me to come and enjoy some of this beautiful island with you and being here tonight. Thank you very much.